activates two kinds of sentiments within local populations within countries. The first one is to suggest that oftentimes, because the historical development of Europe, because we also said sovereignty is the biggest thing, we must not do something to borders, we want to prevent war, all of those sorts of things. To prevent war, you did say sovereignty was important. So sovereignty is something that people see as an inalienable right, that they must have control over the policies of their own land. It is an essential part of their freedoms. At the point at which this sort of stuff happens within the European Union, these like right-wingers are able to suggest that they are taking away your power and therefore are able to use that rhetoric to get more votes, get more power, and also get seats within the European Parliament. The second thing to note also is that economic crises also disproportionately have affected the European Union. So some countries are still suffering from the backlash of the financial crisis. Countries like Greece, etc., for instance, were disproportionately affected after 2008, but also economic issues like COVID do not affect every country across the board evenly. This means that at the point at which economic disaster strikes, even though you have logical explanations for why it's bad, why it might not be the European Union's fault, oftentimes it's easier for these politicians to displace that blame on the European Union's policies precisely because of sovereignty rhetoric and suggest that the Union is therefore exploiting these people, something that we saw in the UK elections. The problem then is you make it very difficult under our side of the house on the comparative to use this rhetoric of sovereignty and economic exploitation, and therefore you decrease incentives for countries to withdraw into the future. Insofar as all of the benefits of all of the economies, for instance, or states within the European Union, all of those benefits come from membership into the Union. If these countries withdraw, we think that this is probably going to lead to lots of harms, and this is probably the most important argument in the debate. At this point, something from closing up.
This is particularly implausible given no country is homogenous. There's a multiplicity of parties, and even those parties that are right-wing have a variety of factions internal to them. You cannot claim this large an impact in the context of this debate.
Yeah, well, so first of all, even if this doesn't happen, I'm just going to tell you why in the next part, why policy that you pass becomes shittier. But the second thing I want to note also is this has happened in the UK, which was one of the biggest countries, and this sort of rhetoric is rising within especially Eastern European countries. So if you really want to say this will never happen, then go for it and assess my structural reasons later. But secondly, in terms of passing policies and more effective policy on our side of the house, I want to know that two things happen on their side of the house in the status quo for you to necessarily pass policy where the margins aren't clear, where it isn't like, lots of countries supporting one policy and other countries not doing so. Essentially, if it's not the forcing scenario, it's likely a deadlock scenario. Now, the problem with deadlocks is that you oftentimes do not pass policy or you take time to pass policy. I think the problem with deadlocks is as follows. Like, one, it's long drawn out, and therefore, lots of policies are required to be enacted in timely fashion. Like, think about economic policies, economic stimulus. All of this sort of stuff needs to be very fast paced. At the point which you have lots of these deadlocks, it, one, doesn't address the causes or the problems that you have, it exacerbates those problems. But two, I want to note that if you have deadlocks, it increases uncertainty within these markets, and all of the markets suffer because of that deadlock. But the second thing I want to note is in the scenario where you must resolve this deadlock and pass policy, that policy is necessarily watered down. And when you water down that policy, it doesn't remain as all-encompassing and all-engaging as you want it to be. So on their side of the house, lots of countries which could have done more do not do more, and therefore you do not get the benefits that you probably want to get. The last point in terms of economic development of policy, I just want to note that obviously there are lots of arenas such as environmental development, how you want to develop certain industries. Lots of that sort of stuff is still unclear within the European Union. We give countries a bit more power in terms of at the very least handling the transition process better, having some authority over that transition process better. We say, one, this allows or gives wiggle room to countries to therefore develop their economic industries not at the cost of massive unemployment or massive shocks to the economy. This means that you are able to develop better, but also if you want to get to the outcomes that other countries like France and Germany are supporting, you probably have more time to invest in infrastructure to build these sorts of projects or enact these sorts of policies. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Okay. Hello.
Am I audible? Great.
Yep.
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. What is completely missing in opening government is the basic characterizations of which policies we are talking about. Which are the policies there are states who will opt out and what is actually going to change. We think These policies have two main criteria. It's first, it's things that are new problems that the EU is forcing in the next years, and secondly, it's new ideologies that try to give the people inside the EU. We think it's things like environmental problems that they're trying to solve, like a green tax or green banking that we talk about. Things like liberal legislation, having same-sex marriages, giving affirmative actions to women. The thing like refugee rights and distribution. All of these things are the change and are the new policies that we are affecting now, and this is what the debate is about. I'm going to have two arguments. First, I'm going to explain, and I'm going to explain why it's extremely bad in the mechanisms to opt out, in which cases it's going to happen, why it's going to harm the liberal legislation of the EU, and secondly, why it's overcome the breaking of power asymmetry between states inside the EU, and why it's the most important thing. For that one short point of rebuttal. So what we got from OG is that non-liberal countries use it to strengthen the narrative of force. But A, just not comparative, because they didn't explain what they are doing. It's not. They're going to claim that they're opting out of all of these liberal ideas, therefore in the comparative, much worse than some fluff narrative. And second, we just think it's completely not true, because I think they have the most large interest to be a part of the EU because they benefit the most from the EU. They benefit the safety net economically. They benefit the employment, the high salaries for their people. They benefit the free trade with richer countries. I think all these things are just much more important for them than anything OG talks about. So let's move to the first argument. Why we think it's extremely bad, and we think, let's explain who is going to be opt out, while in the comparative will be forced to follow that, and why it's extremely bad. Let's start first of all with liberal legislation. We think that you need to know that there is a liberal majority in the EU. Most of the states, except of maybe Poland and Hungary, believe in liberal ideas, believe that the LGBT people deserve equal rights. They believe that women are equal to men. I think that it's happened, that it's something that has a majority inside of Europe. But we think that there are some countries that are against it ideologically. It's countries like Poland that have anti-Semitic legislation and LGBT laws. It's countries like Hungary. We think that in the status quo, we think that what happened that they are just forced to apply this new legislation of the environment or LGBT rights that the EU is forcing them. It can force them in the future and likely to do so. Why is true? Because just as I explained, they are just a majority. It is a majority for liberal countries. Therefore, just if the EU court's decisions reflect the majority of opinions in the EU, they will have decisions that will force these rights. We think it's things like voting in EU legislation, that there is a majority in most decisions that are not unanimous in the EU. They will force it on these people. So therefore, just think that therefore maybe it won't make Hungary and Poland a liberal countries, but they can still ban them from anti-Semitic laws. They can ban them from doing anti-abortion laws. They can force them to have green taxes to overcome the environmental issues that they are forcing. We think that this is extremely important. On the other side, when we talk about multi-speed countries, there's things that are extremely likely to opt out. A, because it's just their ideology. They don't believe in these ideas. They don't believe in liberal ideas. But second of all, just feels like a lot of intervention in their autonomy. They don't want the EU to intervene in legislation they already legislate inside their states. If they have the opportunity to opt out and keep their laws in charge, they will keep and do so. But also, secondly, just they can do it. They have less accountability for what they are doing in front of their people when they can opt out, therefore they will do so. Why we think these things are extremely important? A, just people and the weakest people in these specific states that they're going to suffer from that. It's women that deprive the right to have an abortion and just literally taking their autonomy to do whatever they want with their body. It's LGBT people that need to escape in order to get married in different states and feel that they are in a part of a third world country regime that is forcing them to not fulfill their rights. It's pollution that happens in cities around Hungary that now people have high rates of cancer because there are no taxes that prevent them. But secondly, just things that happens also globally in the EU, because we think that every effect of refugees that don't get their rights, we think that then they move to different states and they make the problems much larger, and same for environmental issues, etc. Now, second mechanism, well, we think it just we stop break the power of the asymmetry, because we think that first of all there's asymmetry of power inside the EU. There are states that are much stronger than the others. Specifically, we're talking about Germany and France. We think that the other are much weaker, both economically and internationally. We think that they just have completely different interests in many cases. We think they have not only stronger econ, but also different economics. We think that they're, for example, France and Germany are more relied on high-tech technologies and high-tech industries rather than other states that have different industries. We think it also have better international relations. Therefore, they have much more abilities to do direct free trade with different states, or to buy vaccines from a specific company because they have this size advantage and money advantage over the other states. We think that in the status quo, we think that the policies that these states, Germany and France, can benefit from, they are forced to give it to all of the other states, the weaker ones. We think it's things like distribution of refugees, refugees, distribution of vaccines, higher corporate taxes, etc. Why we think they're just, of course, because we think they are, even though they are stronger, they are still a minority in every vote. Because we think that there are still countries like Belgium, like Netherlands, like Spain, like Greece, that will vote if there is to be to get to all the states, and not specific in Germany and France. And just think that they have more power when there's an equal vote to each state inside. On the comparative, we're talking about multi-speed. I think they are just likely to opt out. I think it's true because there is a solution. They can show their people that there is a solution for these issues in different places. Refugees will not be in Germany, will make your life better. There is a solution in different places. You can just opt out because now they have the ability to do so. But also, secondly, just think that there is strong EU skepticism, criticism against the government in these states. They will pressure them to do so. They're most likely going to do so and just put all the problems on the weaker state. Before I explain why it's important, bottom half.
The European Charter of Fundamental Rights already protects gay rights across Europe without opt-out. What kind of liberal legislation are you going to bring in?
Yeah, so they protect them to some extent. We think there are still very anti-LGBT laws in Poland, in Hungary. We think there's still not enough environmental legislation in these states. We think there's still future legal problems that are going to be in the future. Like I've explained, these are the things we're talking about. We think that these are the ones who are going to be prevented. Why it's extremely important? We're talking about refugees. We think that when they have a small amount of refugees in the state, it's not that bad, but you have a large amount of them. I think that you can't give them job, welfare, and healthcare for so many people. Therefore, just think that we just deprive these refugees from the basic needs that they're now not getting it because they are not getting being in all of the states. I think it's like COVID vaccination that probably Germany and France would take to themselves in the next pandemic and won't give it to other states. I think it's equal packages to states that are weaker now and have different problems. Why we think that these states are the most important in the debate? They are just the majority. Both the majority of people, the minority as I talked about, are not really minorities. If you take women, LGBT, Muslims in Europe, they are majority. There are more people to care about, but also these states are just the majority. Secondly, just the extent of impact. We are harming a little bit Germany and France, but we think it's not that important for them, but we harm other states. We think the weaker one, I think it's extremely important for the states. We think for these reasons, I beg you to oppose, and I want to thank Tamar for being an awesome partner for all of this really long run for the last 2 years. It was amazing debating with you. Thank you.
DPM.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Let me just put a timer on. Okay. OO literally needs to defend the status quo in which legislation is imposed on everyone. In the status quo, you also have Poland becoming increasingly illiberal. You also have Slovenia defunding their national news agency. You also have Hungary becoming more radical, and none of it happens. You cannot claim the benefit of saying suddenly we'll be able to liberalize the entire Eastern Europe, but at the same time, this is a mechanism that doesn't operate in reality. Why does it not? One, because oftentimes countries change minor laws or change the way they're imposed in a way that obscures the barriers of what is and what isn't European legislation. Secondly, it also means that sometimes they just don't implement European legislation that's been mandated and go to European court, fight it out for the 20, 25 years, pay fines on it, and they're perfectly fine with it. Clearly, there are problems with implementation in status quo if you have a rise on illiberalism. Your mechanism is never explained on your side, never compared to status quo. I have no idea what you're talking about. And we're talking about basic legislation. It is there, but it is not enacted. That is the problem we're dealing with. Secondly, I just don't know how you're willing to stand for something so incredibly illiberal for coming from Europe. You're literally saying, let's override the democratic will of Hungary, of Poland, of Slovenia, because we, the Western European elite, somehow know better than those countries. Like, yes, maybe it is better to have a more liberal Slovenia. First one to say this, but it means that people at home should have the right to demand, and what kind of legislation should it be? Why is it good for us for the Westerns to like liberalize the country? Why is something like overriding of processes at home something that we are going forward, especially where it takes the responsibility away from domestic politicians and puts it in Europe's hands, effectively resolving them of any kind of responsibility of the things they're doing? I'm not sure how, even if this works, they're able to weigh it off against the illiberal nature of a policy, especially in Europe, where Greece, where Spain, where Portugal are crying out that is becoming incredibly illiberal, where Troika can impose literally anything on them. This is the problem of Europe as we see. This is what we tackle. Look, Taha comes in and explains to you the climate in which we are in. It is true that Europe was a great political project of integration, but it is a matter of fact that European identity has not superseded national identities, and the European interest is not something people identify with. As such, it is also not something they predominantly vote for, and also something that is not fully represented within the European Parliament. This is why we need to find a way in which legislation can be written not only with individual people in mind, but individual countries in mind. Okay, within this line, let's talk about firstly politics of Europe and then legislation of Europe, where we make a difference. Firstly, politics of Europe. Look, the problem currently is that ordinary legislation within European Union is passed through the Commission and then the Parliament. What does this mean? It means that at no point there's a representative of the country. There are people that are candidates and members of different European countries and different commissioners, but they need to be by default the representatives of the European people, and by definition superseding any kind of like national identity. What does this mean? At no point in the current legislative process you have the specific interest of Spain considered, or the specific interest of Poland. What does it mean is that you're operating in this random vacuum of like, oh, we know what European interest is, when in the reality there are distinct national interests. What are those? We tell you that specifically taxation policy, that is one of the biggest issues currently in Europe, is differential across the board because of different statuses of development of economies, but also because they have different problems themselves. What does this mean? It means that the average taxation that would be imposed now means that it will be something that's probably acceptable by Germany or France, something that comes closer to the average, not by countries that have a lower growth and would need something else. This is why we say, look, by default, the legislation that considers regional blocks of special interest is likely just to be purely economically better for Europe, not least politically. Secondly, let's talk about politics. What you currently have is that members of European Parliament are absolved of this kind of national responsibility. This is why people also don't see them as a representation of their national interest. Once you're able to do this kind of legislation, members of Parliament also become representatives of national interest, because they need to talk about what does Slovenia specifically want, what does Poland specifically want. This is why you're able to take the breath out of right-wingers who say, look, they don't represent your national interest. But by the way, yes, they don't, because they're not supposed to, and are able to speak about those things exclusively. This is why you're able to tackle this directly. But secondly, it takes away the cover of irresponsibility that current European politicians have, but also domestic politicians have, because it's always saying, oh, but Europe imposed this on us. We are saying, when you're responsible for your own in and opting out, you're not guiltless, which means that domestic social activism is way more able to exert pressure on you, because there are political costs, because they know they're your decisions. Before I move to legislation, POI closing.
So you concede when you talk about economic rhetoric that politicians often lie about this, or there's misinformation. Why then suddenly on your side did they start being completely honest about the European legislative process and you get any of your narrative?
No, they're not honest, but they're responsible for it, which means that you can press on them domestically way more than to say, oh no, but they needed to consider the interest of every country in European Union. You say, no, let's talk about Slovenian interest exclusively. Secondly, on legislation of Europe, what I'm going to say is that oftentimes you have economic interest dominating in these rounds. What does it mean? That the average European country probably has a pretty strong economic interest in certain aspects. What we specifically tell you is that in case of environmental legislation, this kind of opt-in, opt-out is far more likely to produce a more radical environmental policy. Why is that? When you see movements rising across Eastern Europe demanding access to water, demanding protection of water, those are the countries that don't need to engage in this open trade of economics, and are also countries that have historically demanded more environmental protection. When they're able able to write legislation for themselves and not to concede to Germany and their economic interest, you're likely to get more environmental legislation precisely because they're not engaged in this trade-off. Lastly, what we tell you is that this kind of trade-offs are oftentimes here to reform Europe to be overall more democratic. Look, ever since the financial crisis came in, it exposed the fact that national interests are not considered, but the average interest is oftentimes the Western German or French interest. What we tell you is, in this way, you're able to not only bring responsibility to domestic politicians, but also make Europe consider countries and their national interests as well. For those reasons, vote opening.
Okay, DLO.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. I'm gonna get some water. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. We think currently the EU works on a delicate balance between strong but liberal countries being able to perpetuate their ideologies that help many people throughout the weaker, poorer countries, but also being forced to give back economically and give opportunities to those countries, making the connection beneficial to both sides. We think that what government need to stand on is some weird version of the EU in which there isn't actually any cohesion, there isn't actually any cooperation. Many of the policies that they're suggesting countries would do otherwise if it was beneficial to them, they're not going to do, and we just don't think that they hit this balance and manage to get neither the kinds of policies that they want, nor neither the kind of policies that they want, nor the kinds of policies that we're talking about. I'm going to do 2 things in my speech and explain why we think we win. We're going to talk about stability and cohesion and where you actually manage to get more of it. And second, we're going to talk about the kinds of policies you get on either side. And we're going to weigh off why you're better able to get important policies on our side. First of all, let's talk about the fact that, but policies today just aren't implemented because many countries are willing to pay fines. We are aware that there is a trend in some countries towards more right-wing and conservative values. We just think that the comparative is even worse for several reasons. First of all, we think that they're not going to get any of the economic benefits that they get if they also agree to the more liberal ideologies. That means that they are have more incentivized to opt into this thing. Second, we think it is very difficult for them to leave the EU, which is the impact that OG wants to talk about, because they have all of these economic incentives that people rely on in their lives. So leaving the EU would in fact mean leaving current policies, meaning leaving free trade, meaning leaving free travel, meaning people will have to leave their jobs and things like that. So we think it's just very unlikely that they will do so, and more likely that they will agree to some amount of these liberal things. Second, they just didn't address all of the things that we think that the EU is going to go forward with in the future, like carbon tax, like further refugees, like redistribution of vaccines. All of these things are things that we think people have an active incentive to opt into, and therefore we think they are likely to, and we're getting a better comparative world on our side. The second thing they say about this is it's not okay for us to force Western liberal standards on these countries. Why? Because sovereignty and these people should choose for themselves. We think that there are many reasons why the most vulnerable actors within these countries are unable to be sovereign and unable to show themselves. We think that what they're protecting is the majority's right to oppress others because it's not what they choose. I think that vulnerability isn't just a catchphrase, and there are actual reasons why we should prioritize their right over others, because we think that they are least able to compensate for the damage done to them because they don't have the financial or political means to do so, because they are just less diminishing returns for making their life better. So even if they're unable to get married to their partner, but they're able to walk down the street with them, we think that it is better to prioritize them. And lastly, we just think they are least able to benefit themselves. So yes, maybe you're losing some amount of sovereignty because other people can get married, even though I don't understand how that works. But these people are better able to self-actualize and be happy in life, so we just prefer them, so we don't get that way. Then let's talk about stability and cohesion. The basics of AOG's claim is that when nationalistic countries are forced to do things, they leave I think I already explained why when they leave, it's highly unlikely, but let's explain why it's more likely on their side of the debate that people decide that it is not a worthwhile consideration for them. Because currently the EU gives back to those countries. Currently, when there's a crisis and there are refugees arriving to the poorer countries in Europe because they happen to be in the east and are closer to where refugees are coming from, there is a redistribution of those refugees because there is a majority of these poorer countries that are able to put pressure on these larger countries to force them to do those things. When there are vaccines and the richer countries are able to buy them, or the EU as a bloc is able to buy them, there is a pressure from the majority of those countries on the larger countries to give them vaccines as well. What happens on the comparative? We think that on the comparative, these large countries with all of the resources are unlikely to distribute these things back into the EU because they can just opt out. Before that, they could justify to the people within their country and say, no, but we have to do this if we want to stay in the EU, which is beneficial to us. Now they cannot do that. So when people are like, why do I need to wait 6 months for my vaccine for people in Hungary to get their first dose? I don't understand why that needs to happen. In the comparative, in our world, they do that because they need it to get the free trade and to get the economical benefits and to get the liberalization that we get on our side. We think that's exactly the kinds of policies that we're losing, and also exactly why it's less beneficial for anyone to stay in the EU on government side. Then they talk to us about like politics and why the average, why we're going to get deadlocks and why we're going to get watered down policy and why we get just better accountability for politicians on their side. Why do we think that this is just false? First of all, like we explained, there are two separate blocks of majorities within these councils. We think that one majority is that of just how many people there are, and we think that there are far more poor countries that are able to force these countries into big things. That means that the likely, average policy isn't likely to represent only the large countries, but those countries and their needs as well. We think the other kind of majority or power is that of the liberal countries, and we think when it comes to liberal ideologies, because they are rich, they are able to redistribute, and that's the balance that we get. So we just don't buy that there's no accountability or no specific countries that want to apply pressure. You don't need politicians and you don't need them. And we think that when you have those politicians applying pressure, you just get that pressure applied on politicians, you get all of the negative outcomes that Lior explained to you that happen on our side. Before I continue and show us why we get the best kinds of policies on our side, I'll take the opening.
Do you think it is counterintuitive to combat illiberalism by enacting a policy that leads to a rise of illiberal forces across Europe?
We think that there's going to be a rise of illiberal forces anyways, but when people see that it's beneficial for them to have these ideologies because they also get economical benefits and there's free trade and they can go to these other countries, they're likely to adopt it more on a adopt it more. Why do we not care about when there are deadlocks, right? Because we just think that on the comparative is that things aren't going to be effective anyways. Deadlocks force you to compromise, it's true, but they at least allow you to enact some form of policy where people are just opting out for what they don't want to be in. You don't get those policies effectively enacted anyways. The countries who would have opted in would opt in no matter what, if they're forced or not, and the countries who you need to force, you're unable to force. Why do we care about this? First of all, likelihood of the alternative. Most governments' new policies for the big countries are going to happen anyways, but you're losing policies that you need forced to apply. We need those dynamics to get our impacts. Second, we're just like, these impacts are huge on making people's lives better, both in terms of redistribution of wealth and also liberal policies that will make people's lives better. And we're just losing that on their side. But lastly, we're just helping the most vulnerable group, which we explained, not just as a catchphrase, but gave weighings as to why that's a group that we should actually prioritize. Please oppose.
Okay. Member of Gov.
Sorry, I'm here, one sec. Hello, hello. Can you hear and see me?
Yes.
Yeah, sick. It's a very cheery response, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what, yes. I can't find the lids to my pens, that's a wasted pen now. Okay, cool. Yep. Okay, one sec. Okay. Sweet. Panel, I had the misfortune of doing a term of EU law. And if that's taught me anything, it's that the EU actually doesn't have all these magical powers. They're pretty strict and they have to be pretty firmly bargained for. So I'm going to start by responding to OO, which their case belied a bit of a lack of understanding about the European Union, and then go into the case, which is centered on how this institution operates. OO's case was generally about liberal, great, fluffy, happy policies. They didn't really address the impact of bad policies getting pushed through. So their case is at least symmetric because I don't think they really proved why you have more good policies than you have bad policies. But even on the liberal policies, here we go. There are two reasons why liberal policies is not a winning argument in this debate. Firstly, they already have basic liberally requirements to join the EU. I pointed out the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which I thought was a good lesson in EU law. If you want to join the European Union, you have to adhere through minimum safeguards. The response to that from opening opposition is that we want to do more. The problem is, and this is crucial panel, where liberal legislation doesn't exist, this is often because the European Union does not have the legal competence because it is not in the treaties on which the European Union is founded. Things like civil liberties are often not in the competences, and things like vaccines are certainly not because public health is a competence that is wholly outside the European Union's remit. Why is this? Because liberal fluffy things like anti-discrimination aren't just hated by Poland, they're hated by a lot of countries in certain ways because they're scared, for example, of their businesses and lobby groups being subject to large-scale legal duties that they cannot control and cannot foresee, partially in the context of the European Court of Justice's expansionary influences. That's a crucial piece of context in this debate. All these powers of vaccine mass redistribution and liberal policies, EU can't do it under the status quo. What we're going to show you is how you meet the necessary functions of the EU, which co-opts the benefits that you get from opening opposition, even if you get slightly fewer of these policies passed, you have the power to pass these policies. And secondly, talk about why you get better bargaining in our side of the house. On meeting the necessary functions, I think the first point is an important one, but an obvious one. That is that often you have unanimity gridlocks. So certain policies in the EU are majority, certain policies are unanimity. I think there isn't too much gridlock usually in majority policies. I think this differentiation is crucial because it does a lot to differentiate from opening government. Most of the policies that have gridlock are unanimity. These are things like defense, foreign policy, and aid. The issue is that crucial goods can be held hostage by smaller nations that are often politically motivated. Poland and Hungary, that stops benefits accruing. But I think the big point, this is our big extension, you get new competences for the European Union. I thought it was really interesting, having done EU law, that the Infoslide said tax and social matters, because those aren't EU powers under the status quo, which means the motion is probably implying that you can facilitate new competences of the European Union, which are desperately needed when you have this policy go forwards. How? Because EU nations are obviously more likely to sound on to allowing these powers at all in the treaty when they are not concerned that they will be forced into using them. You're more likely to allow tax powers, citizenship powers, public health, or social security when you don't think you're going to be bullied into it necessarily. And I'll also note that because these countries are relatively risk averse, because the ECJ tends to be quite expansionary, they can't foresee it. They're actually more likely to be charitable when they're at the point of negotiation, the individual policies. They're much more hesitant to allow the powers at all because it is the only safeguard they have. What are these competences? Tax, social security, public health, education, there's heaps of them, right? And also EU-specific defense. The EU can fund NATO defense under the status quo, but you allow EU-specific defense, which is new. The best opposition argument, I think this is the clash that we have to win, is that whilst the EU technically on our side might then have the competence, it won't use it in a way that is beneficial because of the multi-speed Europe, right? But given the opening opposition characterization, we think it is fair to say that at least some blocks at any given time probably have shared interest. That is probably a large number of countries at any given time, because it will need to be competences that are added by a majority to the treaties. What are the benefits? So I'm going to talk about why you get benefits of these policies that will make people sign onto them, even if not every country does it, and benefits that are independent of every country signing on. Firstly, more efficient measures. Currently, EU stimulus is inefficient because you can only use monetary and not fiscal policy. That means you can't do public spending. You just have to hope blindly that the low interest rates you set will be passed on by the reserve banks to the banking sector. They very rarely do this. They just often do this to use speculative, shitty investments. Secondly, EU law builds a trust mechanism. If a country, for example, under the status quo is going to get stimulus money, the EU under the status quo has to either trust the money will be used properly, so often stimulus isn't passed because Germany doesn't want to trust Greece will use it properly, or demand structural reform that is harmful to economies before the payment actually occurs, because these loans aren't collateralized, also what the IMF does. EU fiscal policy competence reduces this uncertainty and thus reduces these harms. Thirdly, you solve collective action problems I don't even really need to analyze this because OO did it for me when they talked about vaccination, but public health isn't within EU remit. You actually allow things like, smokers' health to be on the agenda, allow things like vaccination policy writ large, things like the information surrounding vaccinations, because that is a crucial public health mechanism, even if the vaccination supply is within EU remit under the status quo. And fourthly, measures are more direct and hence more equitable. Under the status quo, health insurance only applies to people who are workers and students because the EU has to shove in health insurance to the worker and student provisions. They can't put in a separate health insurance provision. That means it's inefficient because it doesn't actually target health, which is what the EU wants to do under the status quo. It's also inequitable. I don't see why you have to work to get it. On bargaining, why you get better bargaining, firstly, it's less coercive. Under the status quo for majority and unanimity policy, there is incentive for beneficiary countries to push votes through, but not an incentive to offer trades if you are a country like Germany. This is why you don't offer things to get things like Germany and France don't, which is the analysis missing from opening government. Because it is firstly unpopular with domestic voters to offer concessions as Germany. And secondly, there is the alternative of coercive mechanisms, which means you don't have to be generous. Really quickly open it. Or closing. No POIs in the final. That's very bad. Coercive mechanism. Yeah, go.
City agrees that new problems arise, like COVID, environmental, and new liberal progress. The EU was able to legislate against it. But we analyze why when future issues will arise, only on our side, it will still include all the states of the EU.
But if the future issues arise, but you don't have the power ab initio to make that legislation, then your harms and your impacts and benefits don't accrue. That's the analysis I've just been giving you. And that means that Germany and other countries often use coercive EU institutions for certain things, right? So they use the ECB to get things through on economic policy. I think the best response to this is that we're contradictory and we say sometimes small countries are bullied, sometimes they're held hostage. Here is the asymmetric analysis that opening government was missing. That small countries are bullied in sectors where there are other EU institutions and measures that can be tied to the things you want to bully the small countries on. So it's easy to bully small countries in the Eurozone because you can tie ECB stimulus to other policies. You can bully them economically because you can tie it to economic policy. In things like defense, where there isn't a complementary EU institution, which we create under our side, at least you get some kind of bargaining equality, you are unable to bully these small countries. They hold hostage and they hold the rest of the EU hostage. As I've said before, I thought I couldn't debate with ADHD, but Rachel, the severe dyslexic, has made an absolute pleasure. I'm proud to closing Gov. Thank you.
Member of all.
Hi, thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Is this working? Sorry, I got some slight technical difficulties. Okay, no worries. I think it's back. Yeah, okay. Sorry, it went weirdly freezing. Okay. Frozen. Okay. 3, 2, 1. The reality is, when countries enter the European Union, we accept limitations in exchange for universal benefits. I'm going to go through 3 prongs in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to explain why this is a crucial context post-Brexit to enact or reject this policy. Secondarily, I'm going to explain why the selective deployment of this will be incredibly destructive given the inherent connectiveness of the EU market, creating essentially a constant prisoner's dilemma. And thirdly, I'm going to explain the multi-level system of the European Union and why they ultimately destroy that, outframing all of their like small countries analysis and that type of thing. But I think 2 key points of rebuttal that are incredibly important to opening opposition. And broadly, this is just to take out their right-wing stuff because they essentially boils down to the idea that people don't like the European Union and politicians will scapegoat it. But the first thing I would note is the vast majority of individuals actively benefit from the European Union with large-scale projects like COVID, with the fact that they constantly experience travel. The second thing I would note is that many individuals have become used to this. Status quo bias has become overwhelming, and those individuals ultimately buy into that as a good way of living. They fear losing that, and that dominates a large number of individuals. The second thing I would note consequently is there's a multiplicity of politicians that will critique those politicians that scapegoat them, both to external opposition parties and within in terms of those individuals that rise up the ranks, meaning broadly this is delegitimized within Europe. This then becomes a tipping point when we accept that Brexit was incredibly difficult for Britain, i.e. the EU wanted to make an example of them, so they've taken a massive hit to their GDP and dragged that out for an incredibly extended period of time, meaning the vast majority of the EU think that is a complete laughingstock and don't want want to engage with it. The vast majority will not leave. On to the main crux of this. Why is Brexit a unique moment to get like a large number of policy through? I would note three things here that are incredibly important. The first is that Britain, the veto power has been removed, but Britain blocked that for decades. They constantly wanted a veto and used their disproportionate influence at that point to do so. This has been repealed, meaning there's a swath of legislation that is now substantially more possible. The second thing I would note is that there's been large-scale changes in the European Union as a consequence of this. The extended renegotiations in the variety of countries have ultimately changed legislation like conflict of laws that used to be universal but now faces new challenges going into the future. The third thing I would note is that there's a multiplicity of new countries that want to ascend to the EU and Albania, etc., that will present new challenges and push out our borders to deal with new problems, increased inflows of refugees, dealing with the combined threat of Russia, etc., etc. This means two things. Firstly, there's a greater scope of issues that will have to be dealt with, and secondarily, a variety of things that previously were static are ultimately being held back or repealed. This means there's a unique opportunity to do a lot more in terms of tax, in terms of health, in terms of transport, in terms of refugees that we would otherwise waste. Why is this completely destroyed on their side of the house? Because this is the key harm that I would mention, and this will be amplified by the later stuff that will take out their analysis. Because I think what they fail to notice is the fundamental connectedness of all EU policy. Think about it like this. If you want to make the market more free by repealing subsidies writ large that are incredibly damaging to the economy, if France defects from that, given that every EU country is integrated into the same market, that means that you can never pass that policy in the first instance in a way that is successful. Because insofar as one state opts out, this delegitimizes the ability of all states to do it because it gives a massive comparative advantage to them. Three reasons why this is incredibly damaging are likely to play out. Firstly, because now other member states realize that if they're not getting something, when they're wed to the national incentives that OG talks about as being so strong and the coercive mechanisms that CG talks about are consequently likely to get worse due to this, those individuals in those states now have a greater degree of bargaining power to absolutely screw this process, because on issues they don't care about, they can stifle it or opt out or hold that over individuals' heads. This is an automatic limiting factor to a large number of politicians that don't want to be blamed by this, meaning you're unlikely to get universal legislation, or you're unlikely to get that stuff in the first instance. The second thing that then compounds this to a substantially greater degree is, given that you can't pass that policy, that's incredibly important for two reasons. Firstly, you're substantially less likely to adapt to crises, insofar as you just need one populist government now to hold those individuals hostage, or hold those majoritarian policies hostage insofar as they can pull out and just prevent refugees coming in for a certain part that then proliferate into other countries and cause problems. And if Hungary and Poland and such are as bad as they say, they can do that to a substantially greater degree when now they can avoid the, and this is direct rebuttal, plethora of penalties that are imposed upon them in the status quo for doing that, the removal of redistributive aid that ultimately props up those governments insofar as they can feed the poorest by virtue of it. You remove that mechanism writ large, giving those states substantially greater bargaining power to shut down massive crisis. This one means that a lot of major reforms will die that are often essential to a large number of EU citizens. The reorientation of supply lines when one state has a specific geographic advantage, meaning that things like drugs and stuff will not get to other countries as quickly, so they can get what they want through. This probably totally changes the discourse within Europe and fractures a large number of discussions, preventing them happening prima facie, and secondarily creates compounding harms in and of itself, insofar as it drags out things like crises that mean more and more individuals die. Every single day there was not a COVID bailout bond passed for the majority of Europe, 40,000 odd individuals likely died as a consequence of that. Secondly, but before I go on opening government,
fiscal integration has been a dream since 2003. Nothing has moved since then because of differing interests of different regions. You need to make your argument.
Yeah, I'm about to do that, don't worry. Okay, so then on to the last point, which directly responds to their characterization. Because if we boil down the essential analysis that I think also underpins CG, even though they use fancy examples, is essentially big equal powerful. I would have three broad characterizations that are essential to note about the EU. The first is that it is multi-level, i.e. there are multiple tiers at which you have to pass votes. That means that those individuals, like, say you have like the parliament, then you have the other presidential body, then you have the commission, meaning that there's different levels at which you have to appeal to smaller states. Think of it as analogous to the Senate in the United States, where everyone has equal votes to protect the same interests of states. It has to pass each level, meaning small states do have substantial bargaining power. The second thing I would note that is, over the long term, when you force these trade-offs or force these individuals to engage in that, all states have some incentive to maintain the benefits of the economies of other states, talking through it and engaging with it when they're accepting a long-term trade-off, precisely because of that integrated nature of many other areas meaning that over the long term, most powerful states are likely to be broadly sympathetic to this. The effect of that means that over time, when there's more discourse and discussion between politicians, when it is accepted there will be trade-offs and they cannot opt out because all they need is to get sufficient concessions to reach like a 2/3 majority in the vast instances, and in the cases of unanimity, just make larger concessions to get those things through. This means that major policy and stuff that is incredibly important to the vast majority of EU citizens and deals with things that otherwise cannot be solved at a national level, think that no country could solve the financial crisis without borrowing out a huge amount of money, are now likely to be solved to a substantially greater degree. The effect of that means that you probably just get better things and better legislation going forward that adapts to everyone, but also outframes all of their analysis about big states being good and amplifies the massive harm I identify in terms of the now shift to the selective deployment, insofar as all of that legislation just disappears at the point at which you change the discursive norms entirely, versus a broad acceptance of those limitations and the fact that if it passes, they have to accept it. All this says that some states can't be enforced. I think you wouldn't have built the fucking European Union if it didn't have an enforcement mechanism. God bless the United States of Europe. Oppose.
GovWit and streaming people as a Okay. Otwit, can you just confirm you're happy to be streamed?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Okay, and then Orcom, we're back. Okay. Otwit, whenever you're ready.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep.
Excellent. Just give me 2 seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I suspect from the government whip's responses that they didn't quite understand our case. So I'm going to go through it in some detail to make sure that the judges do. The first claim that we made was that the most beneficial policies the European Union is able to pass at any stage in its existence, including into the future when there will obviously continue to be problems, are ones that are literally the definition of a collective action problem. They require all of the countries to take on constraints with the mutual expectation that other countries will take on those constraints so they can overall achieve a greater benefit than they would have on their own. This mechanism literally breaks that because you can never be guaranteed that other states will take on the same constraints as you, so you can never get over the initial step to meet the end requirements. The impact of that for the possibilities of what Europe can achieve within this debate are huge. It means things like lots of types of economic integration, like the dropping of subsidies to client industries within Europe that facilitates more free trade and consequently more economic development, are impossible because you can never be sure that another powerful state won't just keep those subsidies by opting out and get a huge comparative advantage. It means things like the military issues that CG wants to talk about are also impossible because you can't risk sharing vital military strategy if you don't know that other states are going to consent to the mechanisms that you're consenting to make that a safe transfer of information and a safe security breach. This is vitally important as well in moments of crisis, which is when institutions are crucial for literally saving the lives of individuals. Because it's right at that point that you as a politician cannot risk losing your own state's interests and giving over power to another state unless you have guarantees that every other state is meaningfully engaging. That is what we uniquely bring to this debate, to show you that the possibility of the EU to resolve the most difficult issues are huge. But the second thing we point out is that this breaks down the feasibility of the EU to do even smaller things and the more day-to-day measures that's very important to develop the economies of European states, because you have a much less degree of trust between states, given that none of them can be guaranteed that states will carry out policies. Note, this is likely to cause things like specific bugbear issues where states remember times when nearby states did not engage with a specific policy, even though they promised that they would in the negotiation process, meaning you get a much less fluid EU and an EU that is much less likely to actually agree to things in the first place. And this is vital because a crucial impact coming from both government teams is that they reduce the capacity for there to be deadlocks or fighting. Now, that gets infinitely worse when no one has an assurance that the other individuals are willing to work for them. The final thing we say is that you are massively likely to disempower EU institutions external to the legislative process, which rely on a cohesiveness of EU operation, because again, they cannot be guaranteed that into the future, those things will remain integrated, meaning that you can't do things like give the ECB more competency or give the ECJ more competency, because you don't know if it will be able to apply those things at the point at which other states are risking opting out. I would note, unlike opening opposition, this never even requires a policy not to get passed. Just the expectation that other countries will opt out in the future creates all of these immediate harms to the functioning of the European Union. The responses we get to this from closing government are firstly to say that there still aren't that many policies to be introduced because Brexit hasn't had an impact. Firstly, I note that the British veto was much more important than the Nordic vetoes because Britain is a much larger economy and had much more impact on what happened within Europe. Secondly, I would note that as they point out, the incredible complexity of the Brexit leaving process took 4 years to happen. There's obviously new changes that need to be introduced. You can just infer that will continue to be complex in the future. Thirdly, they didn't engage with their point about how a huge amount of countries are ascending to the EU and there are still going to be issues. I would also note that just in general, things like growing the economies of European states, protecting Europe from the threat of Russia, and engaging with things like health crises that happen in the future are just static problems that are likely to use anyway. The other claim they made was that countries will trust each other because there's an inherent degree of overlap between their issues. Firstly, their case itself concedes that there is egoism of states because they say that no one trusts each other enough to be able to get onto the bigger degrees of competency going out. The second thing to say is that it's not a case of states not getting along with each other. It's a case of there being an existential risk to your own individuated economy or your own individuated capacity to operate at the point at which you cannot trust other states to implement the specific things that you yourself are agreeing to. This extends over opening opposition in 5 ways. Firstly, policy. It applies in far more context than the issues that they talk about, because it's not even just contentious policies, because every policy that the EU tries to introduce now becomes a point of contention, because there's always a risk that there will be fights after the point at which you've implemented it, or that you will not notice some trade-off that only happens at the point at which the states near to you are not implementing the same law. Secondly, we're agnostic on the character of the policies. We don't rely, as they do, on the assumption that liberalism is necessarily good, because what we are saying is the policies that states would have supported in a world where they could get everyone to buy into it in the long run now are no longer possible to them because they can't get over the initial hump. At the point at which those states would have supported them, they obviously have an overall democratic mandate and are good just on a collection of preferences. Thirdly, we explain why there are still important policies to happen, because government are correct to point out that most of the liberalization push of the EU has already happened and already exists in things like the charters. We give a unique tipping point with the introduction of Brexit, but we also explain how more general European policy is much harder to do. Fourthly, we also engage on their vulnerability analysis, because when the EU is less capable of responding to crises or less able to do things like guarantee economic stability, that is likely to be incredibly harmful. Fifthly, I know there's just a much greater scope because we've also reduced the capacity of the European Union to operate as a feasible institution. Closing governments say that the gridlocks only happen on unanimity issues. I would point out this is a good argument for just taking away the unanimity on important policies, which is what the EU does, because intuitively, if they didn't do that, we wouldn't have much important EU policy. Then they say you're going to get new competencies. Firstly, I would point out they never explain why you're going to get those competencies and then do good things with them. They just assume that you will necessarily do things like introduce global health issues in relation to the EU. The second thing I would say, though, is that given that they concede these are contentious issues that you don't want to implement unless you have guarantees from other states to do things in the same way that you agree, the same problem iterates itself in the future. So even if you get the competency in the short run and you have an overlap of interest, because you can never be guaranteed the long-run implementation of that interest, you still get blocking of the competencies. Before I talk about bargaining and regionalization, I will take opening government.
The rise of right-wing forces might not get countries to necessarily withdraw, but will definitely force ruling parties and coalitions to not make concessions to Europe. In that sort of context, what are your comparative benefits if policy is not getting passed?
So our comparative benefits are all of the things that the EU does right now, because if the logic of your case was true, the EU would not do anything. It obviously has a major impact on the policies of Europe. That is far more comparative than the deadlock that you necessarily create, because far more policies become contentious. Closing government's claim on bargaining, I would point out often the policies themselves are a form of concession because they help every state within the EU. But secondly, I point out that the coercive mechanisms still exist. As a powerful state, you still have incentives to use them to get the policy passed to the maximum extent, but also in the long run to get states to opt in to the policy into the future. And if they care about the use of coercive mechanisms, use them more and more over the long run, because there's always a risk that states might stop engaging with them. Finally, on opening government, they say that there will be resolved to regional blocks. Our collective action problem applies equally within regional blocks as it does over the EU. Intuitively, this is why many states that are close to each other do not work together without an overall agreement. Then they say that you get bad policies that ultimately harm individuals. I would note in those instances, we're fine for those states to just not follow it and face a sanction. The difference is they have to introduce a systemic change on their side, which stops any form of positive policy actually being implemented. All of that means the EU loses any capacity to do any of the important things it does within Europe, and this policy is destined to fail. I'm exceptionally proud to oppose this motion.
Okay, I'd like to thank the speaker, indeed everyone, for a really great debate. Thank you very much. And that is it. So I believe judges will be assigned to a new breakout room shortly. Take 5 minutes whilst we do that to think about stuff. And I guess the results will come out later. Thanks, everyone.
Sí, esta es la tierra que te cogió cuando la necesitaste. La que se puso a tus pies para que la descubrieras. Es la tierra que saboreaste con los tuyos y de la que guardas infinitos momentos. Sí, en ella descubriste la inmensidad del mar y la fortaleza de la montaña. Conociste el poder de la piedra y la fuerza del viento. Sí, también hubo un día en el que tocaste fondo, pero la pureza del agua hizo que te levantases. Sí, aquí fue donde te dejaste atrapar por la historia, arropado por la grandeza del pasado y los más puros sonidos ancestrales. Y sí, ahora que hiciste todo eso, sigamos descubriendo más. En Lugo, sí.